Mark was sitting on a wooden bench, watching the gentle movement of the trees in the park. The light breeze brushed against his face, bringing with it the fresh aroma of freshly cut grass. This place, with its dirt paths and tranquil shadows, was his refuge. Mark had no home, but that park offered him something no roof could: peace. The distant laughter of children and the hurried footsteps of people around reminded him that the world kept spinning, even when he felt stuck in time. He couldn't remember the last time he felt at peace. Life on the streets was hard, relentless. Each day was a struggle for survival, a constant state of alertness. But there, in that corner of the park, Mark could, even if for a few moments, forget the pains of the past. The memories of wrong choices, of the people he lost, seemed distant when he allowed himself to close his eyes and listen to the birds singing. No matter how hard he tried, the shadows of his previous life always found him. Nights were especially difficult. When silence took over the park, memories came rushing back with full force. It was as if the dark brought forth the demons he tried to bury. But Mark was tired of fighting against them. So, he took refuge in this little paradise, where nature offered a solace that people could not provide. However, the park was also a place where Mark observed life passing by. He saw families walking hand in hand, friends chatting away, and young people dreaming out loud. Sometimes, he wondered how it would have been if things had been different. If he had made other choices, if he had a second chance. But the questions quickly dissipated with the wind, and he returned to focusing on the present, on the here and now. He had his own rituals in that park. A morning walk to feel the sun warming his skin, a brief rest by the big tree near the lake, and in the afternoon, he would sit on the bench to watch the sunset. It was a cycle that gave him a sense of routine, something he hadn't had in a long time. And despite the loneliness, there was something comforting in knowing that, even without anyone, he could still find some kind of peace. But Mark knew, deep down, that this tranquility was fragile. At any moment, something could happen to take him away from this refuge. But for now, he let himself enjoy every second. He clung to these moments of calm, as if they were an anchor in a stormy sea. And while the leaves danced around him, Mark continued to wait. Wait for something he didn't quite know what it was, but he hoped to find one day. Hello, my friends. I'm here to ask a big favor of you. If you enjoy the videos on our channel, please subscribe and help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers this month. Subscribe and help us make this dream come true. Thank you so much, and let's continue with the video. The sun was already high when Mark decided to leave his refuge beneath the big tree. He liked to walk through the park, following the same paths as always, but that day something felt different. The air seemed heavy, and a strange feeling began to grow in his chest. As he walked, he heard voices in the distance, a tone that wasn't common in that place of tranquility. Curious and a bit apprehensive, Mark followed the sound. As he approached, Mark realized the noise was coming from a group of boys, but something was wrong. Their laughter wasn't one of fun, but of malice. And then he saw it, a child, smaller and more fragile, cornered by other boys who were mocking and pushing him. Little Jacob, with tear-filled eyes, tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go. Mark paused for a moment, his heart racing. The scene before him was painfully familiar, bringing forth memories he preferred to forget. He knew what it was like to be in that position, with no one to help. The shadows of his own past seemed to materialize before him, but this time, he wasn't trapped in his memories. He could do something. Hesitation. That was the first feeling that overwhelmed him. He wasn't sure if he should get involved. What could a man like him, homeless and marginalized, do? What if the boys turned against him? What if he just made the situation worse? But at the same time, he knew he couldn't just turn his back. Mark had learned, over the course of his harsh journey, that the worst thing anyone could do was to stand still in the face of injustice. Taking a deep breath, Mark took a step forward, and then another. His mind told him to stop, but his heart pushed him onward. When the boys finally noticed his presence, their laughter diminished, replaced by looks of surprise and distrust. Mark, with his firm voice, commanded them to stop. There was an authority in his tone that even he didn't know he possessed. The boys, caught off guard, hesitated. Perhaps it was Mark's determined gaze, or maybe they just didn't expect someone to intervene. One by one, they began to back away, murmuring among themselves, until they finally gave up and left. Mark stood there, watching until they were all gone. His heart was still racing, but now, mixed with fear, there was a feeling of relief and a spark of something more, perhaps pride. He had done the right thing. And as he turned to Jacob, who was still trying to hold back tears, Mark felt that, in that moment, something new was beginning. Mark was still absorbing what had just happened when he noticed Jacob's eyes fixed on him, filled with a mix of fear and gratitude. For a moment, the two stood there in silence, as if the world around them had stopped. Mark, who rarely engaged with others, felt an unexpected connection with that boy. It wasn't just the protection he had offered, but something deeper, something that touched his own wounds and scars. Jacob, on the other hand, looked at Mark like someone who had just found a hero. The imposing yet gentle presence of that man he barely knew made him feel safe, something that hadn't happened in a long time. Through Jacob's tearful eyes, Mark saw something of himself reflected, the boy he once was, afraid of the world and without anyone to defend him. Without thinking twice, Mark knelt down to be at Jacob's eye level, his eyes searching the child's with a softness he didn't even know he possessed. "Are you okay?" The question was simple, but laden with genuine concern. Jacob just nodded, still processing what had happened. Mark extended his hand to help him up. There was a tenderness in his gesture that seemed to surprise both the man and the boy. As Jacob stood up, still holding Mark's hand, the two moved to the side, away from the spot where the bullies had been. It was as if, together, they were leaving behind that moment of fear. Mark, not wanting to seem intrusive, began to talk about simple things, the weather, the park, anything that could distract Jacob from what had just happened. His voice was calm, almost reassuring, an attempt to lighten the weight he knew the boy was feeling. Throughout the conversation, Mark began to open up, almost without realizing it. He talked about how he also enjoyed spending time in the park, how that place had become his refuge. Jacob, now more at ease, started to share about his life, his school, and how he also saw the park as an escape, a place where he could just be a kid. The conversation flowed naturally, and Mark realized that, despite how different their lives were, there was something that connected them in that moment. Time passed quickly, and soon the sound of approaching footsteps pulled them from their moment of connection. When Mark looked up, he saw a man coming toward them, tall, with a serious expression, but it softened when he saw Jacob. It was John, Jacob's father. Mark let go of the boy's hand, feeling the tension return to his body. The man approaching represented what Mark had lost long ago, a stable life, a family, security. And even without knowing it, Mark felt that brief moment of peace was about to be interrupted. John approached quickly, his eyes scanning the scene before him. He saw Mark next to Jacob, and for a moment, concern washed over his face. John was a man who carried the responsibility of protecting his son at all costs, and the sight of Jacob near a stranger made him quicken his pace. When he finally arrived, he knelt down to examine Jacob, checking to see if he was okay. "Are you all right, son?" John's voice was firm, but there was a hint of anxiety he couldn't hide. Jacob, still holding Mark's hand, nodded. "I am, Dad. This man helped me." Jacob's words hung in the air for a moment, and John finally looked up at Mark. There was a tense silence between the two men, on one side, the natural distrust of a worried father, on the other, the insecurity of a man who didn't know how he would be judged. Mark took a step back, releasing Jacob's hand, aware that his presence might not be welcome. He could feel the distrust in John's eyes, an invisible barrier that seemed to grow with each passing second. Mark was well acquainted with that look, the one of someone who judged before getting to know. It was a reflection of a society that often saw him only as a homeless man, lacking value. However, he remained calm, understanding that John was only trying to protect his son. "Thank you for helping my son," John finally broke the silence. There was gratitude in his words, but also a distance that Mark couldn't help but notice. It was as if John wanted to thank him, but at the same time keep Mark at bay, as if trying to understand who he was and why he was there. Mark nodded, saying little. He knew this wasn't the moment to explain himself or try to get closer. The important thing was that Jacob was safe. Jacob, on the other hand, didn't seem to want to distance himself from Mark so quickly. He held onto his father's arm, insisting that John not be so quick to judge. "Dad, he was very brave. He saved me." Jacob's words were sincere, and John noticed the bond his son had already formed with that man. It made him hesitate for a moment. He looked at Mark again, this time with a little less distrust, but still cautious. John knew appearances could be deceiving, but he also understood that Jacob rarely attached himself to someone so quickly. He stood up, extending his hand to Mark in a gesture of respect. "I'm John," he said, trying to break the barrier that had been between them. Mark shook John's hand, feeling a different weight in that greeting, a mix of gratitude and caution. Even with the distrust lingering in the air, that simple gesture seemed to open a small door, suggesting that perhaps something more could come from this unexpected encounter. In the days that followed the meeting in the park, Jacob couldn't get Mark out of his head. The figure of that man who had appeared at the most unexpected moment, driving away danger with a silent courage, had left a deep impression on the boy. Every time he passed the park with his father, Jacob looked for Mark, hoping to see him again. He felt there was something more to discover about that mysterious man who, for some reason, seemed so familiar, so safe. John, on the other hand, remained cautious. He knew his son had a generous heart, but he couldn't shake the worry for Jacob's safety. However, every time Jacob mentioned Mark, there was a sparkle in the boy's eyes, an admiration that John rarely saw. And that made him think. There was a connection between them that he didn't fully understand, but couldn't ignore. Perhaps, just perhaps, Mark was not just another stranger in the park. One day, while they were walking together, Jacob spotted Mark in the distance, sitting on the same bench as always, under the shade of the trees. Without hesitation, the boy pulled his father's arm, insisting they go over. John, with a mix of reluctance and curiosity, followed his son. As they approached, Mark looked up, surprised to see Jacob accompanied by John. He hadn't expected to see them again, much less this way. Jacob ran up to Mark, smiling as if he were greeting an old friend. Mark's reaction was cautious, but seeing the genuine joy on the boy's face, he relaxed a bit. "Hi, Mark. Can I sit with you?" Jacob asked, his voice filled with excitement. Mark nodded, making space on the bench. John watched the scene closely, still a bit suspicious, but seeing how Jacob sat next to Mark made him feel that something special was forming there. Over time, Jacob's presence became a constant in Mark's life. The boy appeared in the park whenever he could, bringing a little light to Mark's days, which until then had been marked by solitude. They talked about everything, from school challenges to Mark's past stories. Each conversation seemed to strengthen the bond between them, a bond that John was beginning to understand and, little by little, accept. John, though still cautious, began to see Mark in a new light. He saw the positive impact that man, whom he had once judged with reservations, was having on his son's life. And gradually, John started to allow Mark to get closer, even if subtly. It wasn't easy for him to trust, but Jacob's insistence, combined with the growing admiration the boy felt for Mark, began to break down the barriers he had erected. There was something special about that unexpected friendship, something John could no longer ignore. As days turned into weeks, John's initial caution began to give way to sincere curiosity. He watched from a distance as the friendship between Mark and Jacob blossomed. With each encounter in the park, John saw his son becoming more confident, happier, and that touched him in ways he hadn't expected. Mark, with his simple ways and wisdom gained from the streets, seemed to have a special understanding of life that he conveyed to Jacob almost naturally. However, John still held some reservations. Even though Mark had proven to be a good influence on his son, the father and John couldn't ignore the questions that arose in his mind. Who was Mark really? What had led him to live on the streets? Why did he seem so lonely despite being someone who clearly valued human connections? These were questions John pondered as he watched from afar, trying to understand what exactly was unfolding before his eyes. One day, while Jacob and Mark were talking under the shade of a tree, John finally decided it was time to get a little closer. He didn't want to invade Mark's privacy, but felt he needed to know more about the man who was becoming so important in his son's life. With firm steps, John walked over to where the two were seated, pretending to be casually visiting, but Mark sensed the seriousness in John's eyes as soon as he approached. "Mark," John began, with a tone softer than he usually used, "I would like to know more about you. Jacob talks a lot about you at home, and I think it's time we got to know each other better." Mark, who hadn't expected this kind of approach, was surprised. He had grown accustomed to Jacob's presence and, gradually, to John's as well, but he never imagined John would make such a request. There was something in John's voice that told him this conversation was important, not just for John, but for him as well. With a nod, Mark began to share his story, not all the details, but enough for John to understand the reasons that led him to live on the streets. He spoke of mistakes made, of lost opportunities, and how, despite it all, he still found beauty in small things, like that park that had become his temporary home. John listened attentively, feeling his distrust lessen as Mark's words revealed a soul that had suffered but had not given up. After that conversation, something changed between the two men. John began to see Mark not as a stranger, but as a complex human being, someone who, despite his circumstances, still had much to offer. He didn't say anything at that moment, but as he stood up to leave, he offered Mark something more than words, a gesture of trust. "If you need anything, Mark, you can count on me." And with those words, John left the park with Jacob, knowing that on that day, a new bridge had been built. The following weeks brought subtle but significant changes to Mark's life. The conversation with John had been a turning point, and although he didn't want to admit it, something inside him began to open up again. Perhaps it was the feeling that someone, besides Jacob, was starting to see him for who he truly was, beyond appearances, beyond the difficult circumstances that had shaped his recent life. However, this new dynamic also brought with it an opportunity that Mark had never imagined would arise. One afternoon, John found Mark in the park, as usual, but this time, there was something different in his gaze. He approached with a serious expression, but not one of distrust. It was a type of seriousness that carried a proposal. "Mark," John began, after they exchanged some usual pleasantries, "I've been thinking a lot about what you told me. I know things haven't been easy for you. I've also been through tough times. And I believe everyone deserves a chance to start over." Mark, who until then had maintained a carefree demeanor, fell silent, sensing a slight tension in the air. John continued, carefully choosing his words. "In my shop, we need someone. An experienced mechanic who understands cars, but who, above all, is reliable. It's not much, but it's honest work. And from what Jacob told me, you have a knack for working with your hands. What do you think?" The proposal caught Mark off guard. He didn't know what to say. It had been so long since someone had offered him something like this, a real opportunity, a new beginning. His first reaction was to retreat. Life on the streets had taught him not to expect anything from anyone, to keep his distance to avoid disappointment. But something in the way John spoke, and the sincerity of his look, made Mark want to believe that, perhaps, this was the sign he had been waiting for. I don't know, John. It's been a long time since I worked in a shop. I don't know if I'm still capable," Mark replied, his voice laden with uncertainty. John smiled, a smile that carried understanding and encouragement. "We all doubt ourselves at some point, Mark. But I believe you can do it. And Jacob believes it too. That's enough, don't you think?" Mark felt a wave of emotions. There was fear, yes, but also a cautious hope that he hadn't felt in years. With a sigh, he finally replied, "Okay, John. I accept." And with those words, a new door opened for Mark, one he never thought he would have the courage to cross. He knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, he was willing to try. After all, it wasn't just for him, but for Jacob and John, who had reached out when he needed it most. The first days of work in the shop were challenging for Mark. The smell of oil and grease, the familiar sounds of tools clanging against metal, all brought back memories he had left behind. There was a mix of nervousness and anxiety in every movement he made, as if at any moment he could make a mistake that would reveal to everyone that he was no longer the same mechanic he once was. But despite his insecurities, Mark forced himself to continue. He knew this was his chance, perhaps the last, to rebuild what he had lost. John watched him closely, not with critical eyes, but with silent patience. He knew Mark was facing more than just the challenges of the job. He was battling his own internal demons. And although there were moments when Mark seemed on the verge of giving up, John was always there, with a word of encouragement or a simple gesture that showed he believed in Mark's potential. Gradually, this confidence began to make a difference. However, the days weren't all about progress. There were moments when the scars of Mark's past reopened, reminding him of his failures. Every screw he tightened, every engine he tried to fix, brought forth not only technical knowledge but also the pain of his losses, the mistakes that had led him to live on the streets. There was one particular afternoon when he encountered a complex mechanical problem, and frustration took over. Mark's hands trembled, and he had to step outside to get some air, feeling on the verge of a breakdown. It was Jacob, as always, who made the difference. The boy appeared in the shop, smiling as always, bringing with him a lightness that seemed to dissipate the dark clouds in Mark's mind. "Hey, Mark, you're doing really well," Jacob said, with the simplicity and sincerity of a child. These words, so simple, touched Mark in a way he didn't expect. They reminded him of why he was there, of why he couldn't give up. It wasn't just for him, it was for Jacob, for John, and for all the people who believed in him when he had given up on himself. Over time, the shop began to transform from a place of challenges into a place of healing for Mark. Every problem solved, every engine that started running again, was a small victory, a step toward reclaiming his dignity. And with each victory, no matter how small, Mark felt his confidence grow. The scars of his past were still there, but now they seemed less painful, as if each day of work was healing those wounds, bit by bit. John noticed this change in Mark, and it filled him with silent satisfaction. He saw the man who, weeks before, was just a shadow of himself begin to come alive again. Mark still had a long way to go, but now he was no longer alone. With John's support, Jacob's friendship, and the opportunity given to him, Mark began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could truly rebuild his life. And so, each day in the shop became more than just work. It became a symbol of rebirth, a testament that, with support and determination, even the deepest wounds can begin to heal. As the weeks turned into months, Mark began to feel a change within himself. It wasn't something that happened overnight, but a gradual transformation, almost imperceptible, that settled slowly in his heart. The work at the shop, which at first seemed an impossible task, was now becoming a routine that he not only mastered but also started to enjoy. With every engine he repaired and every car that left the shop running perfectly, Mark felt a pride he had forgotten he was capable of feeling. The scars of his past were still there, but they were not as painful anymore. Instead of being bitter reminders, they began to become parts of a story he was finally willing to tell, a story of overcoming, of second chances. Mark, who once walked with his head down, started to lift his gaze. He noticed the small changes in himself, a smile here, a witty comment there. Things he thought he had lost forever were coming back, piece by piece. It wasn't just his confidence in his work that was growing. Mark also began to notice changes in the way he viewed the world, and most importantly, himself. He, who had always seen himself as someone on the margins of society, now saw himself as part of something bigger. He had a purpose, he had people who believed in him, and that made all the difference. Mark began to look at the future with less fear and more hope, something he never imagined he would feel again. The days in the shop were no longer just about fixing cars. They became a metaphor for Mark's own life, a series of problems to be solved, of broken parts that needed to be fixed. And every time he managed to solve a problem, he felt that he was, in some way, fixing himself too. The shop, which once was merely a place of work, had now become a place of personal transformation. John, always observant, noticed this transformation in Mark and felt grateful for having followed his intuition. He saw the man who had been lost find a new path, a new purpose. And more than that, he saw Mark begin to connect with the people around him. The shop, once just a business, was now a place where friendships formed, where laughter was shared. Mark, who once isolated himself, was now part of this small community, contributing not only with his work but with his presence. Jacob, of course, was at the center of it all. The boy continued to visit the shop, always with a word of encouragement, always with that smile that seemed to light up even the darkest days. And every time Jacob showed up, Mark felt he was exactly where he needed to be. He didn't know where this new path would lead him, but for the first time in a long while, he was willing to find out. The transformation was real, and Mark knew that, finally, he was in control of his own story. As the months went by, the friendship between Mark and Jacob deepened in ways neither of them could have predicted. What began as an unlikely connection in a park evolved into something that shaped their daily lives. Jacob, with his childlike curiosity and open heart, continued to be a constant source of light for Mark. And for Jacob, Mark became more than a friend. He was a mentor, a father figure who taught him lessons that went far beyond what could be learned in school. But it wasn't just Jacob who was changing. John, who initially viewed Mark with suspicion, began to make space in his life for this man who, in such an unexpected way, had become part of the family. John watched with a mix of surprise and satisfaction as Mark and Jacob understood each other without the need for many words, as if life had already taught them that the value of things goes far beyond what is seen on the surface. The bond between them became so strong that Mark began to feel part of something greater than himself. He was no longer just a man trying to find himself again. He was part of a network of affection and trust that supported him in both good days and bad. Mark, who for so long had closed himself off to the world, now found himself not only accepted but loved, in a circle that included not only Jacob but also John and the other workshop employees. There was one particular day that was etched in Mark's memory. Jacob had just come home from school, as excited as ever, and brought with him a project he was developing. It was something simple, a wooden cart he wanted to turn into a functional toy. Mark, with the patience and skill he had developed in the workshop, helped the boy plan and carry out each step, but it was more than just a project. It was a symbol of the trust and affection they had built. John, watching from a distance, saw how Mark guided Jacob, teaching gently, allowing the boy to make mistakes and learn from them. And in that moment, John realized something he hadn't noticed before. Mark was not just a friend to Jacob. He was a father figure, someone who was filling a void that John, with his own struggles and absences, sometimes could not fill. And this, instead of causing jealousy or insecurity, brought John a deep sense of gratitude. Over time, Mark, John, and Jacob formed a kind of triad, each supporting the other in different ways. What began as an unlikely friendship transformed into an unconventional but deeply connected family. And as Mark watched Jacob grow, he also saw himself grow, not just as a man who had overcome his past, but as someone who had finally found a place to belong, a place where he was needed and loved. And that was the greatest victory of all. As time passed, Mark began to realize that his life was indeed taking a direction he had never imagined. Every morning, when he opened his eyes, he felt a mix of surprise and gratitude. Surprise at being where he was, in a routine that gave him purpose, and gratitude for having found people who believed in him, even when he doubted himself. The work in the workshop, which at first seemed merely a chance for survival, had now become a passion he had rediscovered. Mark was not just fixing engines, he was building a future. This internal transformation was also reflected in the relationship he maintained with John and Jacob. The workshop, which had once been a place of work and learning, became a space where dreams were shared and plans began to take shape. John, who once viewed Mark with suspicion, now considered him a partner, not only in work but in life. There was something special in the way they interacted, as if each knew exactly what the other needed without it needing to be said. Jacob, for his part, continued to be the bridge that connected these two lives. He watched with admiration as Mark grew, not only as a mechanic but as a person. The boy noticed the small changes, the renewed confidence, the more frequent smile, the willingness to teach and learn. For Jacob, Mark was more than a friend or mentor. He was a living example of how life can transform when one finds support and love in unexpected places. Then, one day, while they were working together on an old car, John looked at Mark with a serious but hopeful expression. "Mark," he said, wiping his grease-stained hands on an old rag, "have you thought about what you want for the future? I mean, beyond all this?" Mark, caught off guard by the question, fell silent for a moment. He had never thought of the future as something beyond the present, as a space he could shape in his favor. But as he reflected, something inside him began to take form. He thought about the months he had spent in the workshop, the nights he had gone home tired but satisfied, and the days when Jacob made him see the world with more hopeful eyes. "I think I would like to keep growing, John," he replied, his voice carrying a sincerity that came from the depths of his heart. "Not just here in the workshop, but as a person. Maybe, one day, I could have something of my own, something I could call my achievement." John smiled, a smile that showed not only approval but also pride. "I believe you can, Mark. And when that day comes, know that you will have our support, no matter what you decide to do." That conversation, simple and straightforward, planted a seed in Mark's heart. He, who already saw himself in a better place than before, was now beginning to dream of an even brighter future. It was not just a matter of survival, it was a matter of allowing himself to dream and believe that those dreams could indeed become reality. As time went on and Mark felt increasingly integrated into his new life, he began to realize something that perhaps had always been there but was now becoming clearer: the true power of kindness. Not the superficial kindness, but that which comes from a deep place, a genuine willingness to help others without expecting anything in return. The kindness that had transformed Mark's life, that had rescued him from a life of despair and loneliness, was the same that he now felt the need to return to the world. One day, while walking through the park where it all began, Mark found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to that point. He remembered the fear he felt when he intervened for Jacob, the initial distrust from John, and how, in a simple gesture of reaching out, his life began to change. It wasn't the grand acts that made the difference, but the small daily actions, the moments when someone chose to be kind, to be understanding, when it was easier to turn away. Mark began to realize that kindness had a multiplying effect. What John and Jacob had done for him, he now found himself doing for others. In the workshop, he started to notice customers more attentively, offering a sincere smile, a word of encouragement. In moments when he was alone, Mark found himself thinking about how he could help someone who might be going through a situation similar to the one he faced. He began to get more involved in the community, offering help wherever he could, not because he expected something in return, but because he knew how much it could mean to someone. Mark's transformation did not go unnoticed by John and Jacob. They saw how he was becoming more confident, more secure in himself, and at the same time, more generous and open. There was a new light in his eyes, a light that only comes from someone who has found peace with himself and with the world around him. For John, this was confirmation that he had made the right choice in trusting Mark. For Jacob, it was proof that heroes don't need capes or superpowers. Sometimes, they are just ordinary people who decide to do the right thing. Over time, the impact of Mark's kindness began to spread beyond the workshop. People in the community began to know him not just as the good mechanic, but as someone they could trust. Someone who, with a simple gesture, could make someone's day better. Mark had become a positive force in the lives of those around him, something he would never have imagined during the dark days when he was alone. And so, as Mark continued his journey, he understood a profound truth: kindness is a choice, one he now made every day. Not out of obligation, but out of gratitude. Gratitude for those who believed in him when he no longer believed in himself, and for all the small moments that, when added together, led him to a place of peace, purpose, and finally, happiness. Mark's life was a living testament that no matter how dark the road may seem, there is always a light waiting to be found, and sometimes that light comes from the kindness we share with others. The story of Mark shows us that no matter how difficult the journey may be, there is always an opportunity for change and growth. Now, I ask you, what would you do if you had the chance to transform your life? Would you have the courage to face your fears, to accept help when you need it most? And, more importantly, are you willing to extend a hand to someone who, like Mark, may be waiting for just a gesture of kindness to change their story? If this story touched your heart, think about how you can make a difference in someone's life. Maybe it's a friend, a family member, or even a stranger. Sometimes, a small gesture is all we need to transform not only someone else's life, but also our own. Are you ready to be that change? If you enjoyed this story and want to continue following content that inspires and provokes deep reflections, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. This way, you won't miss any of our upcoming videos. Speaking of which, check out the videos appearing on your screen now. They may be exactly what you need to take the next step in your transformation journey. Let's go together on this.